My name is Nicole Monroe. I'm your host for a very important segment from Let the Women Speak community. Today's episode is based on suicide and domestic violence, the power of transformation, examining indirect impact of domestic violence from childhood, adolescence to adulthood with Ceara Roopchand from London, United Kingdom. As a victim of domestic violence, I must inform you, this episode is informative.
Happy New Year to everyone. My name is Diannem from Let the Women Speak movement. And we're adding something new for the new year. And the first video out of studio will be with Ceara Roopchand, who you have seen in one of the first videos back in 2019 through Globespan 24/7. We have a very important topic we're going to be talking about today as we begin the new year, and it's about support system. But before we start talking about the topic, I'm going to let Ceara introduce herself because we've had our journey together, and this is important in this topic about the vision of transformation. So Ceara?
Thanks, Diane. So hello to everyone watching, and my name is Ceara. I'm from the UK. My family are predominantly based between there, but also Guyana and parts of the US as well. I have a very interesting background, so not only am I part Guyanese through my mother, but I'm also part Irish through my father. I'm born in London, so a real melting pot of cultures going on there, some complementary, some not so complementary. And, you know, this is my opportunity to share my transformation story with you all. So I'm currently I'd like to say quite successful in terms of pursuing my education. I did very well in that aspect all the way up to achieving a master's, and I'm now working on developing my career with some very ambitious goals at the start of the 2020s, but also right through to the next 10 years to the 2030s. So that's a little bit about me, and as we go on in depth, we'll sort of pick at that a bit more and explore how I've got to where I am now as we develop the conversation.
This journey at the beginning of the year, it's about the power of transformation. So we're going to talk about how not to let your past define you and how important support system is. And we're going to discuss about going from support systems, about traditional support systems versus non-traditional. And saying it in that term, I'm going to throw the mic over back to Ceara, and she will elaborate on that because we had this long conversation, and we'll explain everything as we go along. So thank you again for joining us on Let the Women Speak movement. And Ceara?
So some of the best conversations that take place are ones that are often unplanned, and you could be in a car going somewhere on a journey. It could be you start off a conversation on topic A and you end up on something completely different, and that's exactly how we've ended up where we are in terms of talking about support systems. So when we think about the notion of traditional support systems, most people tend to think about the role of the family, particularly if it's a young person, the role of the parents, perhaps grandparents, depending on cultures, and siblings as well, before thinking about the wider family and how the wider community fits into that. But what we've seen, particularly over the last sort of 20 to 30 years, is a sort of shift and change in what support systems look like. And, that could be for a variety of reasons. For example, particularly with the Guyanese community, there's been a mass migration of people from Guyana to diaspora communities, whether that's in the US, Canada, the UK, or further afield. But it's also down to, for example, advances in technology, having access to information that's easily accessible as much as from your phone to a laptop or a computer. but also being able to share knowledge and exchange information with one another, which has helped to broaden our horizons. And it's helped us to think about the ways in which support systems have evolved. So as a recap, just some of the sort of individuals that could be involved in terms of a sort of non-traditional support system could vary between having a coach, a mentor, a counselor. It could even be friends, possibly friends that you've grown up with from childhood that, you know, you've seen through to adulthood with, and, you know, you have that bond and relationship to be able to be, you know, critical friends, and you praise each other and support each other through the good times. But when you feel as though, you know, you may have a friend or an associate that's not particularly, you know, on the path that they had hoped to have seen themselves, you could be that critical voice and just be a sort of a friendly reminder in that sense. So it is shifting away. The sort of traditional sense of how we know support systems is what I would say is coming towards the end of its life cycle. And I do think we need to start thinking about how we term or sort of how we coin a phrase to describe the new forms of support systems that we're seeing in place. And it's also worth remembering that, you know, no support system will look the same for two individuals. It will obviously vary on your circumstances. It will vary on the sort of resources and what you have at your disposal. And it will vary according to what you're looking for as an individual as well.
I'm glad you actually said that no two support system would look the same, because, I mean, us knowing each other, and this is kind of like our 10th year in journeying together through mutual paths in terms of work that you've worked along with me, and I really truly appreciate that. So looking back at my time period and yours, you're absolutely right, because growing up, for me, being Guyanese and migrating to the US and traveling across the country or abroad, I don't think the support system back in my time was as how it is now, with the you know, external support system that you talked about, you know, and looking at how important family is, because so many times young people are going through so many things, and we tend to brush things under the rug because we don't want the neighbor to hear, we don't want this one to know, you know, your daughter end up getting pregnant, or, you know, your son is gay, or whatever it might be. So it could be so many different scenarios that, you know, the support system in the home that I think many young people look for, it doesn't materialize. And as Ceara said earlier, how the support systems could look different, and looking at external. And one of the things that, aside from what you had mentioned, you had talked about, you know, that outside support system being like a priest, an imam, pandit, you know, in the religious settings. And even that sometimes could be a little bit complicated, and we can talk about that, because that's like a session by itself.
Absolutely.
So for you now, journeying this last 10 years, so because this transformation and looking at, you know, the fearless woman I am, and making your mark, and looking for me for Let the Women Speak, and this year I've seen your journey going through your own personal struggles, your strive and push for educational advancement. You know, I'm so proud. If I had a daughter, and I've always told everyone, and let's hope I don't cry now. If I had a daughter, I couldn't have asked for more than you, to see that you did your bachelor's degree. You struggled through that. You got to do your master's.
Yeah.
That was also a struggle. And to see how you push forward. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the last 10 years and, you know, the support systems that have been a part for you, whether, you know, it's been good, it's been bad. And I also want to know, and we didn't talk about this, what are some of the things as the external support system from me that either I could have done or not do, and that's okay.
My first year of university, I was studying economics, and there was a grant available to us for anybody that wanted to submit an application to carry out a good social deed anywhere in the world. And my first instinct was, well, so many good deeds that I wanted to do, but I always wanted to do something in Guyana. So it's the place of my mother's birth, but it's a country that's very close to my heart as well. I have lived in Guyana as a child. I've schooled there. I have very close family there. So there's a very strong connection to the Caribbean and South America for me. So, as all millennials did back then, when you needed support for a project, you went onto Facebook and you put a post up, and I was like, well, I've got this opportunity to submit a grant. And if anybody is interested in doing some work in Guyana and supporting my submission, then get in touch. And lo and behold, there was this Diannem Madre that came up on my Facebook, and people were singing her praises and saying, you got to get in touch with Diannem. She's the go-to person for this kind of work. And the rest of it from there just spiraled and absolutely blew up. And we've had some fantastic projects that we've worked on together, which we'll talk on much later down the line, in terms of support both ways, not just you supporting me, but also me supporting you. So that's the sort of the overarching story of how we came to know each other. But Diannem came into my life at quite a pivotal moment, because I was starting out at university. I was only about 5 or 6 months in, and I was the first person in my family to go to university. So it was a massive milestone. I'm a minority ethnic, working class. I'm classified as growing up under multiple areas of disadvantage, and as a woman to go to university from an Indo-Caribbean household, it's absolutely massive. It's a stride in the right direction, but there are challenges that come with that still. It was expected that I would go to Oxford and study something like law, but it was never in my wildest dreams to do anything like that. So I went to, what is considered a polytechnic, and, their colleges converted into universities to support people from backgrounds like myself, to help us get degrees where traditionally we wouldn't have stood a chance or an opportunity to. So that in itself was quite a struggle, because I didn't really have a support system to guide me through that university process. I didn't know what I wanted to study. I didn't know about, financial management, and I didn't have any older cousins or any aunts or uncles that had been to university or been through that advanced stage of the UK education system to give me any advice or to support me or to point me in the right direction. So the support there was very, very narrow, in the sense that school would only advise you on your application, and then once you got in, you were left to your own devices. So this was 2010 when I went in, and a lot has changed, so credit to support systems that have since developed. But back then as an individual, very, very challenging. And even going through, when it came to exams and learning to time manage and cope with pressure. And I did work part-time because I had to financially support myself, because again, I didn't have that traditional family support system there. So, that brought with it its own sort of struggles and challenges. And it also gave me the idea that I needed to reinvent what my support system needs to look like, because the traditional sense wasn't working for me.
For someone looking at this and listening to you and hearing your story, can you journey a little bit with that? And taking that from your experience and pushing forward, because your story could have been different, and we've talked about this several times, even up to recent to you coming here. Mm-hmm. And we've been spending these years together, the last 4 years. So at the end of the year, Ceara and I have been getting together at the end of the year, and kind of like recapping everything for the year and moving into the next year. So moving into the next year is journeying this, like in this manner. Mm-hmm. So we can share it with other people who might need that support system. So let's come back to that now, Ceara. Yeah. Looking back at the structure and the breakdown of it, because as I said, it could have gone in a different direction. You could have ended up on drugs. You could have gone in a different direction.
Absolutely.
Like so many other young women or young men who haven't had that support. So break it down for us.
So my mother and father had broken up when I was about 18 months old, and my mother after that got with somebody else who she ended up marrying, Indo-Guyanese. So the household was very sort of Indian Guyanese culture, centered around that culture. I didn't have much relations with my father, so I didn't have much of the sort of Irish culture or upbringing in that sense. And, you know, unfortunately, between my mother and my stepfather, there was a lot of domestic violence incidents. I can remember some.
You saw those things?
Yeah.
What did that look like?
My earliest memory of one was when I was about 4 or 5. And, you know, they are really horrific. And, you know, people that are either a perpetrator or a victim may not consider the child in that process. But actually, as children, I can tell you, we do remember these things. And, you know, we do carry those visions or those experiences or what was said in those episodes, even though we are witness to it. So in a way, we are a victim, and it may not be directly, but the secondary effects of domestic violence by being in that environment is felt. And it's, you know, it's quite a sort of deep, heavy feeling to carry it. It is burdensome, so to say. But that was only sort of one component of other issues that were going on. So, you know, there was also the stigma of, you know, a man raising another man's child, and that had created tensions between my stepfather and my mother, particularly when, you know, my siblings were born. There was the issue of alcohol abuse, but also substance abuse, and, you know, issues that still carry through to today that have never truly been addressed by my parents' generation. So, you know, there's compounding issues that you're trying to cope with there, as well as, you know, the sort of struggles and difficulties of at home, you're brought up in a very sort of Caribbean, West Indian mindset of thinking and functioning. But then when you go out to school or you go out into the workplace, or generally outside of the home, you know, it's very different, particularly in the UK. So we've done very well to balance ourselves in terms of merging our cultures and our ways of living together. But there are still some stark differences where Indo-Caribbean societies in particular are known for certain societal dysfunctionalities or cultural dysfunctionalities that we possess that other groups may not necessarily have issues. So it's an issue that, despite I grew up with that in the 90s and early 2000s, we still see that being perpetuated in diaspora communities as well as in Guyana to this day, and we're now in the 2020s.
So as we're talking about the support system and not allowing your past to define you, Ceara talked about, you know, the lack of the support system and the breakdown of the framework of the family dynamics she grew up in. And speaking about domestic violence, I think one of the things that we don't see a lot about or hear a lot about until recent, and even not much research is out on silent victims. Mm-hmm. And Ceara being a victim in the sense, but a silent victim, and how she has taken the power of transformation, and that's what this episode is about. It's about the power of transformation, taking the experiences from the past and not allowing it to define you, mm-hmm. and being a silent victim. So, Ceara, let's talk about being the silent victim, mm-hmm. in the domestic violence experience around the adults. So we'll call them that because I know it's your mother, your father, stepfather, the adults in your environment. So
yeah, so I mean, putting it into context from my own experiences, you know, a lot of the memories that I remember led to a lot of issues in terms of my character building. So seeing a breakdown in the particularly familial support system as a result of domestic violence had significant sort of knock-on effects in terms of my development of my character as a child. So I was often, you know, very quiet. I was more observant than I was vocal because I was always scared of, you know, just doing something at the wrong time and, you know, you're being hit or you're being yelled at or whatever it may be. So I had a lot of that fear growing up, particularly around sort of the ages of 7 and 8, which was quite a sort of significant period where I witnessed a lot of DV as a child. But things like anxiety, so I as a kid used to get really nervous, you know, when there was confrontations or raised voices, or sometimes as a kid you're sensitive to picking up emotions and reading the dynamics of people in a room, and I could always tell when something was about to sort of kick off in that sense. And for me, it was like, oh, you know, someone's going to get hit, or, you know, a glass is going to go flying, a door is going to get punched, a wall is going to get punched, the police will get called, and things like that. As a child, you know, you do panic because it's, you know, these are things you shouldn't be seeing. You know, your child is supposed to be about sort of building those happy memories, building your character, learning and developing, skills as children that we should be doing, not necessarily experiencing that. So, it led to me eventually by about the age of 11 or 12, I ended up having to get a counsellor through school because the effect that it was having on my work in school and my inability to concentrate. I'd turn up to school feeling incredibly exhausted because I wouldn't get enough sleep. And the school thankfully picked up on that, and that's where my support system started to change.
All right, so before you talk about when the support system started to change, let's talk about right before that. What are some of the emotions, because you talk about emotions.
Yeah.
What are some of the emotions that might have, because you talked about anxiety, right? What are some of the emotions or feelings that you might have started to go through that led to the need for the support system within the school? And that's extremely important. So for those of you tuning in, especially with children from domestic violence homes, silent victims, whether a parent is alive or dead due to domestic violence, homicide, and who are left with, extended family members, there's so many behavior patterns that starts to exhibit some aggression, some subtle behaviors that, might not be so overt to the eye. And it's important to begin to look at some of those things. And with Ceara being here, we're talking about, the importance of support system. The past don't define you. Don't allow in the past to define you, and the use of the power of transformation. Because to see this young lady sitting before me and looking back almost 10 years, I am so extreme. I'm not her mother biologically, but I feel as a mother to her, and to see the development, and to be able to sit here and to have this conversation, not just before you, the audience, but the conversations we've had, and to agree to do this session, to share that with you. So can we talk about
the feelings,
the emotions, and what led to that support system?
So I think the most significant feeling I remember, the one that's very memorable and sort of printed in my memory, is the feeling of fear. And the feeling of the unknown, because you don't know when the next episode is going to happen. You don't know if you go to school one day and by the end of the day you get a phone call that, your mother's dead or your stepfather's dead, one has killed the other, because we know it's common practice in the community.
Did you think, at what age were you at that point?
At that point, I was about 10, 11. I had those thoughts.
So really, you honestly, at that age, that young of an age, you started thinking that, would you go home to a dead mother? Or,
because of the nature of the violence and just how bad it was, I thought that, one or both would end up dead. And I didn't know if it was one, I didn't know who it would be. Because sometimes, they say if you keep smacking a dog on the nose, it will bite you. And the same thing can happen in domestic violence. Majority of cases, it is the woman that is the victim. But there can be times when a woman can turn and something tragic can happen where it ends up being that the perpetrator loses their life. So you just I never knew. And it did cross my mind. And that's why there was fear and there was unknown, because you'd wake up one day not knowing what the end of the day could look like. And as a child, that's a very frightening feeling, because we're used to having an expectation of routine. We know as kids, we'd wake up, we'd go to school, we'd come home, or there's after school club, you do homework, you have dinner, you bathe, you go to bed. But that wasn't necessarily that wasn't orthodox for me, because I could go home and there could be a drinking session going on. There could be, extended family members that have come round and they've decided to, have a drinking session and a cookout. And it could be a Tuesday, it could be a Thursday, it could be a Saturday. So that unpredictability in behavior was what instilled that fear in me, because I just didn't know what I was going home to. Sometimes I could go home and everyone's happy with watching cricket. Other days we could go home and there's a full-blown fight taking place and there's holes in the walls that weren't there before.
Were you the only child in that environment when all of this was taking place?
So I do have a younger brother. He's 8 years younger, but I think given how young he was, he probably doesn't remember a lot of things that happened at that stage, because he would have been 2-3 years old. Whereas by then I was about 10-11 years old. So for me, it was very clear what was going on.
Right.
I was able to read the situation. But despite me being a witness to it in the way that I was because of my age, I was singled out more by my stepfather, predominantly because I was somebody else's child. And I was singled out a lot for that, and he would let that be known to me that, you know, I should be grateful that he decided to you know, be with my mother because I'm someone else's child, and, you know, no other man would ever do that. And, you know, I should be grateful for everything I get in life because, you know, if it wasn't for him, my mum would be nothing, I would be nothing. And, you know, that sort of psychological abuse that seeped in that my brother wasn't exposed to because my brother is his son, whereas I was the stepdaughter. So there was that sort of tension there.
So can I just say, to our viewers tuning in, as I'm listening to this, you know, like over the almost 10 years, you know, I've heard so much from Ceara about this journey and the stories, because we'll have these conversations, whether we talk on the phone or we get to see each other. The last 4 years we've been meeting in one place, you know, and you know, I'm feeling the words that are coming out of her, and I'm thinking in my head as I'm hearing this journey, I can't imagine, because I've worked with so many families, whether here or in Guyana or anywhere else, who talk to me about this, and some children who, due to confidentiality, I wouldn't even mention where or whom, who have told me their stories growing up in homes like Ceara just described. And one of the things that that has happened is, even like with dysfunctional homes like that, sexual violence, that, you know, with silent victims like young adults like Ceara, who've grown up in domestic violence home, whose sexual violence is there, with stepfathers, and I know that didn't happen in your case. But in other cases, and I said due to confidentiality, so those who are tuning in, I will not discuss those individuals, but I have experienced that. So it's important that as you're tuning into this and listening, you know, there's so much with young people who are growing up in domestic violence homes, who, whether the parents are still alive or whether the parents are deceased, and the dysfunction that comes with it, and that trauma. We're going to go into further discussions as we move along in these episodes. But today it's about Ceara's journey, and how proud I am, and I do want to say that publicly, how proud I am for this journey, for the 10 years of where she has come, you know. But hearing when she's talking about these things and the emotions, it's, you know, it's heartbreaking to know that young people are going through this, and then we have suicide, you know. So can we jump into, when we're talking about emotions, had you ever at any point felt suicidal?
So I recall when I was 14, I think twice I tried to take my life. But I think, thank God, due to not having the access to technology that we have now, I didn't know what to do or how to do it. So it was 2 botched attempts to take my own life, because, you know, the pressures of, at the time, my father sort of outed me in terms of my sexual identity to my family, and he wasn't very approving of it. So he put a lot of pressure on me that, you know, I had to tell, for example, my grandmother, and if I didn't tell her, then he would tell her, and he would tell my mum, who was in the US at the time. So there was a lot of pressure on me, and I couldn't take it, because I knew even at that age, I knew what had happened to young West Indian people that came out to their family. So given the pressures of what was going on in the sort of family, again, what should have been the traditional support network, and the pressures to do things that I didn't necessarily want to do, you know, the idea of taking my life just seemed like an easier option than having to, you know, speak to my family about something that I didn't truly understand myself yet. So I didn't have the confidence to do it, and I didn't have, you know, any support from either of my parents at the time to do it. And it wasn't, on my mum's case, in her defense, it wasn't because she was disapproving. She just wasn't in the country at the time. But, when I had told her, she was very supportive. So, my hat's off to her for that, because she completely sort of surpassed my expectations in terms of her response. Given the pressures that, my biological father was sort of forcing on me from his end, and me not having my mother around because she was abroad at the time, I just sort of felt like I didn't really have a sort of coping mechanism or a traditional support in the sense of family to help me go through what I was going through at the time. So, that did lead me to attempt suicide twice. I self-harmed, quite a lot, and I do have marks on my body to this day that reflects that part of my life. But I was quite fortunate to have, a school counselor who had known me for a couple of years at that point. So she got a true understanding of just what I was going through in terms of my family life and my home circumstance, but also understanding the sort of cultural sort of pressures and expectations that was on me as a minority ethnic person, to truly, give me the best advice and guidance that she could. And, it was thankfully to her and two close friends that I still keep in very close contact with today. They were my support system, and, they may not be traditional, but to me, they were my essential support system, because if it weren't for them, who knows what the turnout could have been. It could have been very different from where we are today.
So knowing what you know, and sharing that, and I want to thank you for sharing that, publicly. So let's say if someone is tuning in to this now, or hits on this and comes across this video and listening to your story and hearing that particular part, and they're experiencing some difficulty or at that last straw where they want to take their own life, what would you say to that person, knowing what you know then and where you are now? Right? Because you're kind of like a halfway point from that experience.
Yeah. I mean, what I would start with is, the one thing not to say is don't do it. That's not an effective response. I think the best way to talk down somebody that is feeling, in a low mood, leaning towards sort of depressive thoughts, suicidal thoughts, is have a conversation with them. Unpack what's going on with them, because more often than not, a conversation can prevent a person from taking that sort of last step, that drastic action. And, I've seen that work quite well, particularly in London, where, the pressures of living in the city and whatnot. There are a lot of young people that feel as though taking their life is the solution. And when we see the sort of public coverage that comes with it, 9 times out of 10, that suicide was prevented by simply talking to that person and trying to get them to open up about what it is they're feeling, what is, what are their struggles, what are their challenges, what's eating them up. And, if you can, how to offer some support, where they can go to for guidance. Sometimes it's the case that they need professional mental health services and access to that. Other times they just need someone to lean on and someone to unpack that with. But
you see how you said someone to lean on and to unpack that with.
Yeah.
What if, and we know, coming from Guyana and some of the communities may not have the social service, the counselors that you have experienced in the UK,
absolutely,
and other parts of North America, Europe and other places. So where we have countries that may not have that support system, and somebody might be tuning in, what would you say in the non-traditional sense that somebody, so let's say if I didn't have the counseling skills or the knowledge that I have, what are some of the key things I could listen to? So let's say if you and I had met, right? Or you were that child of mine and that dysfunctional home or whatnot, what could I have tuned into? Or the auntie and the uncle who might be raising that child.
Yeah.
What can you tune into without being, the skilled professional, the counselor? Yeah. What are some of the, and then to be able to say, okay, well, I need help. I can't do this alone.
I've always gone by the principle that, for all the faults and problems that we see in our community, it's first and foremost is to understand the underlying cause of those problems. And I think once you get an understanding of those root issues, it helps you to address it better. So, for example, you know, as a child, I was very quiet, I was very introverted, I wasn't very sociable in school. But for you to truly understand why I'm like that, you need to understand what's going on behind the scenes. And we know that things like domestic violence, alcoholism, any form of abuse really is very rife in Guyana, in certain, you know, communities more than others. And I think if you feel as though, whether you're that auntie or uncle even with a child, and you feel as though you don't really understand that child, what you can do as a starting point is try to understand what that child has been through first of all. Because by understanding those experiences, then you can start to unwrap, why is this child behaving in a way that they're quiet or they're aggressive or they play up or they seek attention? And then by understanding their experiences, you understand those behaviors, and then you can work on how to address those behaviors. But I'm not saying, you know, there's no one size fits all approach. And there are some cases that are so complex and very complicated that you do need the services of a professional, a mental health professional. And there's a serious lack of capacity. And, you know, where there is capacity, it will tend to be in Georgetown first, as it's the capital. And if you're lucky, it may branch out to a couple of other sort of coastal towns. But then, you know, that's missing the point that the majority of Guyana's population does not live in the capital. They actually live in the countryside. Right. So how do you target people who have, you know, multiple health needs, whether that's physical, mental, emotional, psychological, in regions where they don't have the infrastructure and the capacity to deliver that in the first place? Because the expectation that, oh, well, you know, if you build it in the capital and they will come, that's not a realistic prospect for many, because they don't have the funding or, you know, the means in any other way to be able to get to the capital. So the notion of, you know, having mental health professionals in Guyana that can, you know, deliver and work with some of the complex demands of the Guyanese population at large, and whether that be, you know, young people that don't have that support system at home and have been through domestic violence or sexual abuse, or have had, you know, suicidal thoughts or tendencies, or, you know, whether that's somebody returning to Guyana that's perhaps been deported from the diaspora community, and, you know, the sort of mental health challenges that come with that, and, you know, reintegration back into Guyanese society. You know, where is the support for people like that? So, you know, the support is not going to be a one size fits all for everybody. It is going to have to be tailored, you know, individual needs, and also an understanding of different backgrounds will have to take precedent, because remember, Guyana is a melting pot, and the needs of different communities will vary, whether it's by, you know, ethnicity, religion, you know, social class, so to say, and it cuts across all those boundaries. But those different characteristics need to be taken into account as well when we're talking about provision for mental health.
So if you're now tuning in back to this particular segment, we're talking about, you know, the power of transformation and not allowing your past to define you. And this episode is about, you know, the support system, the traditional versus the non-traditional. And we're going to touch on the intergenerational impact of the non-support system. So I'm going to have Ceara talk about that.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting, when you sort of start to deconstruct it, it's quite interesting when you analyze, you know, how is it that we are still experiencing levels of domestic violence that we are experiencing, not just in Guyana, but generally across the Caribbean.
Across the globe.
Across the globe.
Yeah.
You know, how is it that, you know, things like mental health in terms of intergenerational haven't been addressed? You know, what's going on there? So there's a lot to deconstruct. And for me, I think the one thing, or one of many things I've taken away from my experiences in terms of transforming, is that whatever my parents had put me through is not necessarily their fault, because we don't necessarily know what they grew up with. We don't know their stories. We don't know their experiences. We don't know their traumas. And, you know, from my experiences with both of my parents, I can see that they are very hurt I can see that they have had experiences that they have not addressed themselves, and these are experiences that stems to their early childhood. And as a result, that has now manifested over decades and has perpetuated itself down to the next generation.
You know, just to mention what you just said, I really truly appreciate that your analysis on that, because I know you've come a long way to understand and to come to that point, and not to create the internal anger. So when we talk when we talked about emotions, to not allow the emotions of anger and blame, like it's my father's fault, it's my mother's fault. So I must say I'm very impressed that, you know, during this trip with you here and having this conversation today, that you're not allowing the anger, and you'll come to a point now moving into the next decade of that transformation, and not allowing your past to define you, to develop that anger and blame, you know. But to see and to understand that they too, your parents, the adults, may have had their own trauma and their own experience. So how does that make you feel? Like moving into the next decade now, you're starting to let go. So that's a good thing.
Absolutely. So I think, you know, again, it's about not holding on to things that are beyond your control. You know, a person may have had a not so good upbringing as a result of things that have happened in the family. And these are things that can stem from both parents, grandparents' generation, aunts, uncles, cousins, possibly, you know, older siblings, whatever it may be. But do not allow what's happened in the past to determine, you know, your direction of travel. Because if you do, you're really limiting yourself. And, you know, you're not doing yourself any justice by having that sort of mindset. So, you know, for me, when I think mostly in the last 10 years, when I've thought about, you know, how far I've come and everything that's happened, it's not a blame game. You know, there is no justice. I get no justice for blaming my parents or for blaming other family members for what happened to me as a child. What's happened has happened. Yes, I acknowledge that, but pointing fingers is not going to change what's happened. Absolutely. Holding in anger and hatred will not change what's happened, and it makes you a very bitter, resentful person. So for me, the best remedy to everything that had happened in my childhood, and you know, it was awful, but for me, it was about letting go and carving my own path, you know, determining my own fate, and, you know, pursuing things that I'm passionate about. So, you know, you know that I've worked in sort of policy and development for quite a few years now. And one of the key areas I've been working in the past couple of years is education, particularly promoting more diverse routes into education for people that come from backgrounds where pursuing education is not necessarily high up on the agenda, whether that's for cultural reasons or otherwise. So, you know, I try and give back through, you know, different channels and pushing my passions through those channels to make sure that other people do have opportunities to change their life. And education is just one of many paths, but that's the path that I had chosen to sort of channel my energies into, because holding on to it does no justice for anyone.
Right. So we're talking about, you know, letting go of, you know, the past hurts, the anger and the resentments, that might have come from, you know, the adult's experience and in the trauma. And, you know, obviously you have said you've learned to let go, use the word let go, and to move forward. So moving forward into the next decade, because the wonderful thing is, and I hope it's okay to say, you know, you're moving into that next decade now, next year? No, this year.
This year.
Wow. Oh my God.
Chapter 3.
Yeah. You're going to be
30. Big 30.
So it's not just 30, but it's celebrating our 10 years together this year. Because we're going to come back at the end of the year and look back at this video.
So my journey now is based predominantly on career progression. So I've sort of completed that stage where you're trying to get your foot on the career ladder. I've done that pretty successfully over the last 2 to 3 years. So for me now, it's about progressing, moving up that ladder, and working towards the sort of higher objective by the end of the decade of being at quite a senior level in terms of working in policy and development. I'm not limiting myself in terms of where I work. So, if you're interested in hiring me across the world, I am available.
Hey, listen, this could be the resume.
Exactly. I am available. So, get in touch with me. More than happy to have a chat.
You will travel any part of the world.
I will travel any part of the world. I have no restrictions.
And we're working on some stuff together for Let the Women Speak.
Absolutely.
So,
there's a lot to look forward to, particularly towards the end of the year. So do keep tuning in and keep up to date with what's going on.
And we are going to be working on policy as part of Let the Women Speak. Without disclosing too much, we are going to be working on some issues on policy development and making some changes in laws and stuff like that. And that's the growth of where, for me, I'd like to see Let the Women Speak move in the direction for to make transformative changes in the laws that we need to bring to fruition for families, for women, for children, and so on. So Ceara is going to be working with me on some of those. So, yeah.
So can't reveal any more than that. You'll just have to tune in and keep following what we're doing throughout the year. But just to add in terms of sort of what's happening for me sort of this year, taking it further into the decade. So we've mentioned career, and I think sort of in a personal capacity as well, most young people from the UK want to own a home. So that's something that I'm working towards over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So hopefully I can invite you at some point to my house and we can be doing this from the comfort of my sofa in London.
Remember,
who knows?
you always have a home here.
Yeah.
And wherever here is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's always.
So maybe we take it across the ocean one year. Who knows? So just a lot of it's about sort of personal development as well as professional development for me. But like
for both of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talked about this, about in just not professional development, but personal development, because I'm looking at that for myself as well. So, and yes, absolutely, not just sitting in this living room having this conversation, but taking this conversation with other people in other places, which we will be doing. So.
Yeah, and I think just sort of to wrap up on the end of sort of my goals and ambitions, I mentioned obviously the start of my 30s later in the year. So it is my hope. It's my hope that I get to do something quite sort of memorable and spectacular. So to share some exciting developments in terms of what I get up to. So watch this space.
So one of the things is that as we are beginning 2020 like this, Ceara and I have sat down and we've done this between us, and she's had to write down the things that she was making a transformation for that particular year. And when she comes back at the end of the year, she gets to we get to review that. So this is kind of like different because we actually have a video that we're going to come back to, and that's this. So she gets to come back to at the end of the year, and we get to regroup, and hopefully, God willing, that we'll be able to share this with you, folks tuning in, and we can transform Let the Women Speak in a transformative direction. So as we come back to talking about the power of transformation, how your past should never define you, and the key to this segment is about support systems in traditional and non-traditional. So if you joined us from the very beginning and heard about when we talked about what the traditional support system looks like and the non-traditional support system. So one of the things in closing, what I would like to say, and we're going to expand on this, Ceara and I, is that the traditional support, which is the familial and so on, parents and etc., and the non-traditional, meaning the mentors, friends, and some of those kinds of support system. If those things sometimes for some people might not either be available or work, I think sometimes, I believe that you have to do your own internal work, because it's not necessarily that, the family will be there to support you. or the friends or your partner will be there to support you. You have to sometimes step back and do some of the work on your own, that internal work. And I think in my own personal journey over the over the past 10 years and moving in directions in the path that I have traveled to, it's been a lot of individual work. And sometimes it's about being alone. And being alone sometimes, not sometimes, being alone doesn't necessarily mean being lonely. Being alone is not lonely. So, Ceara, you want to expand on,
I think to add to that, I think there's, more emphasis should be put on people spending times by themselves and actually enjoying your own company. I think growing up as youngsters, we always believed that, if you liked to be by yourself, you were a bit of a loner. But actually, that's something that should have been encouraged and nurtured from a young age, to say, it is okay to be by yourself and to have, opportunities to reflect, review, think about yourself, think about your growth, think about what's going on around you. So if that's something that you haven't done or you haven't thought of doing before, give it a try. And it might not work the first time or the first couple of times. It does take time.
Definitely.
It took me about 2 years to appreciate my own company, because I was so comfortable with always being around my external support system that there was a point where I couldn't go a single day without being in touch with one of them or seeing one of them. Whereas now I can gladly go, a week, 2 weeks even. Sometimes I'll go on holiday and I won't keep in touch with that support system, because I've learned to appreciate myself, my own company. I've learned to, reflect, think deep about things, which also helps with sort of planning and preparation as well. So, planning for this year, but also the new decade, that doesn't come from, constantly being around and engaging with people. That comes from a lot of inner thought and self-reflection as well.
And I think, but that is, in the external relationships, it's not about the quantity of time, it's the quality. So if you have that external support system, it's not that you have to be around them 24/7, or, every day you have to have someone there that, you can not see someone, like we don't see each other until the end of the year. So, but we talk throughout. Yep. And it's a quality of time in just that 1 week, or whatever days you travel to be here with me. And I truly appreciate that so very much. So I hope we can have many more years like this.
Of course.
I
enjoy being here as much as you enjoy hosting. So.
And then we can get our gray hairs and well, I'll still continue coloring mine. I don't know about you.
Got a few.
Yeah. So I think also when we're reflecting back on this conversation about support system and that transformation and not allowing your past to define you, one of the things that I just want to touch on also in closing is that, and I've told Ceara this over the years, and many of the young people that I've mentored, when you're going through these challenges, and these trials, that might kind of put a block in that growth. I think sometimes you have to ask, how bad do you want it? And remember, over the years, when you've had challenges, I've always said, how bad do you want to get to that, and are you willing to do the work? Because, as a mentor or someone providing support externally, we can't do the work for you. You have to do the internal work, and it has to come from within. So again, it's about how bad do you want it? And how much of the work are you willing to do? And sometimes, again, as we both said earlier, some of that work has to come from within.
Absolutely. I think just sort of reflect on what you've said. I think one of the things not to say to someone that probably hasn't sort of found themselves yet or is going through states of, whether it's mental health, depression, silent witness or victim to domestic violence in particular, if people are feeling a certain way, it's not very helpful to say, don't feel like that. And that tends to be an automatic reaction from someone. You know, if you say to someone, "Oh, I'm feeling sad," "Oh, don't feel sad. Be okay." And you know,
why do you feel sad?
Yeah,
you know.
but it's okay to feel those feelings, and it's okay to process, you know, what's going on at that time. So the same way you would do that with positive feelings, apply the same connotations to when you are feeling sad or you're down or whatever it may be, and you know, process that, because that's a skill in itself, being able to process things regardless of whether it's good or bad. You know, you have to take both in equal measure. And again, it's not something that it's something you learn overnight. It takes a lot of time, but I think, you know, if you know of someone that could possibly need, you know, a shoulder to lean on, I think the most important thing in general is just to listen, be open, be receptive, allow that person to say whatever it is that's on their chest. And sometimes that's all they need. They don't actually want you to say anything. They just want someone to listen. So, you know, be that support, be your brother's keeper, be your sister's keeper, as we say. And more often than not, you know, you don't have to counsel words of wisdom when that's not what we're saying, but just be open and, you know, be impartial in your views. Don't hold judgment if it's something you've not come across before. If someone's coming out and saying, you know, I'm seeing violence, or I'm having issues with my mental health, you know, don't shun or shame a person for it, but, you know, be open and let's be more supportive, and let's be as supportive as a community that we know we can be generally.
Be supportive as a community, and that's very important.
Yeah.
And I think you said about process, and just to add from, you know, I mean, I don't want to sound too clinically, but, you know, process is ongoing. So sometimes you might have to go through the process 10 times, 20 times, or 100 times until you get it right to fit what your need is, you know, because as we said earlier, each person is their own individual, and the process has to be your own growth and journey. And it's important in that transformation to begin to make that step forward. We're going to continue this conversation as we go through the next 12 months. And if you hit us up, we'll be able to share more with you. So thank you again for joining us. And Ceara, thank you for...
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Any last words?
You know, as I say, if anyone wants to reach out to Dianne or myself, I invite you to. I'm always happy to have conversations, no matter where you are in the world. Time difference is irrelevant to me. So, you know, do reach out to us. If there's anything you would like to see covered in these vlogs or in these postings, again, you know, do let us know. It's all about making sure that we are catering to the community. So if you feel that, you know, there's a gap there that's not being filled, I'm sure Dianne has an army of people ready to come on and share their two thoughts.
Yes, we do.
But in the meantime, again, a huge thank you and appreciation for having me on and for listening. And I hope that for a lot of you, my story can serve as inspiration. You know, you're not alone in what you're going through, or someone that you know is going through. That there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but the hard work starts with you. And as Dianne alluded to earlier, you've got to want it. You've got to really want something to make that change. And I'll leave it in that.